The Battle of Bir Hakeim took place at Bir Hakeim, an oasis in the Libyan desert south and west of Tobruk. During the Battle of Gazala, the 26th of May, the 21st of June 1942, the 1st Free French Brigade, General de Brigade Marie-Pierre Koenig, defended the position from the 26th of May the 11th of June against much larger German and Italian forces, commanded by General Obersterwin Rommel. The captured Tobruk 10 days later, but the delay imposed on the Axis offensive by the defense of the fortress influenced the cancellation of Operation Hercule, the plan for an Axis invasion of Malta. Rommel continued to advance and invaded Egypt, slowed by British delaying actions until the First Battle of El Alamein in July, where the Axis advance was stopped. Both sides used the battle for propaganda, Winston Churchill renaming the Free French as the Fighting French and Hitler called the French the second best fighters after the Germans. Background: 8th Army. At the beginning of 1942, after its defeat in the west of Cyrenaica the 8th Army faced the Axis troops in Libya roughly 30 miles west of the port of Tobruk, along a line running from the coast at Gazala, southwards for about 30 miles. Both sides accumulated supplies for an offensive to forestall their opponent, and General Claude Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief of British Middle East Command, hoped for the 8th Army to be ready by May. British code breakers tracked the dispatch of convoys to Libya as the anti-shipping offensive from Malta was neutralized by Axis bombing and was able to forecast that the Axis would attack first. The 8th Army was not ready to take the offensive, and so Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, the Army commander, planned to fight a defensive battle on the Gazala line. Auchinleck's appreciation of the situation to Ritchie in mid-May anticipated two Axis strategies: a frontal attack in the center of the Gazala line and then an advance to Tobruk, or a flanking move to the south looping round towards Tobruk. Auchinleck saw the former as more likely, with a feint on the flank to draw away the 8th Army tanks, while Ritchie favored the latter. Auchinleck suggested that the tanks should be concentrated near El Adem, well placed to meet either threat. Since Operation Crusader in late 1941, the 8th Army had received M3 Grant tanks with a 37mm gun in a turret and a 75mm gun in a sponson, which could penetrate the armor of the Panzer IV at 650 to 850 yards. The frontal armor of the Grant was thick enough to withstand the 50mm PaK 38 anti-tank gun at 1,000 yards and the short-barreled 50mm KWK 38 gun at 250 yards. The first 112 x 6-pounder anti-tank guns had arrived and been allotted to the motor brigades of the armored divisions. Panzer Army Africa. At the meeting of Axis leaders at Berchtesgaden on the 1st of May, it was agreed that Rommel should attack at the end of May to capture Tobruk and then stop at the Egyptian border, while the Axis captured Malta in Operation Hercule and then invade Egypt. The finished converting to the up-armored and received 19 times Mark III Special with a long-barreled 50mm KWK 39 gun. 4 Mark IV Special with long-barreled 7.5 cm KWK 40 guns had also arrived. German military intelligence Abwehr had broken some British military codes, and in late 1941 Black, the code used by Bonner Fellers, a U.S. military attaché, the British divulged much tactical information to Fellers, who unwittingly reported it to the Axis as well as Washington. Until May, monthly deliveries to Libya averaged 60,000 LT, fewer than the smaller Axis force received from June-October 1941, but sufficient for an offensive. The 900 miles advance to Gazala succeeded because Benghazi was open, reducing the transport distance for about of the supplies of the to 280 miles. The capture of Malta would not alter the constraints of port capacity and distance. Protecting convoys in a large port close to the front would still be necessary for a decisive victory. Air attacks directed by Kesselring on Malta reduced its offensive capacity, and supply convoys from Italy reached the Axis forces in Africa. Unternehmen Venezia. Operation Venice. The Axis plan of attack was for tanks to make a flanking maneuver south of the fortified box at Bir Hakeim. On the left flank, the Italian 132 Armored Division R8 would neutralize the Bir Hakeim box, and on the right flank, the 21st Panzer Division and 15th Panzer Division would advance north behind the 8th Army defenses, to destroy the British armor and cut off the infantry divisions on the Gazala line. On the far right of the attacking formation, a 90th Light Africa Division, Generalmajor Ulrich Kleemann, battle group was to advance to El Adem, to the south of Tobruk, cut the line of supply from the port to the Gazala line, and hold Allied troops at Tobruk by simulating a strong armored force, using dust machines made from aircraft engines and propellers mounted on trucks. The rest of the Italian 20th Motorized 1st Corps, the Italian 101st Motorized Division Trieste, would open a gap in the minefield north of the Bir Hakeim box near the Sidi Mufta box, to create a supply route to the armor. Rommel anticipated that having dealt with the British tanks, he would have captured El Adem, Ed Douda and Sidi Rezeg by nightfall and the Knightsbridge defensive box, about 40 kilometers northeast of Bir Hakeim. The Axis tanks would be in a position to thrust next day, west against the 8th Army defensive boxes between Gazala and Alem Hamza, meeting the eastwards attack by the Italian 10th and 21st Corps. By late May the Axis forces comprised 90,000 men, 560 tanks and 542 aircraft. Prelude, Gazala Line. Between Gazala and Timamai, just west of Tobruk, the 8th Army was able to concentrate its forces sufficiently to turn and fight. By the 4th of February, the Axis advance had been halted and the front line had been stabilized. From Gazala on the coast 48 kilometers west of Tobruk, to the old Ottoman fortress of Bir Hakeim, 80 kilometers to the south, the Gazala Line was a series of defensive boxes accommodating a brigade each and laid out across the desert behind minefields and wire, watched by regular patrols between the boxes. The Free French were to the south at the Bir Hakeim box, 13 miles south of the 150th Infantry Brigade box, which was 6 miles south of the 69th Infantry Brigade box. The line was not evenly manned, with a greater number of troops covering the coast road, leaving the south less protected, but the line was behind deep minefields. The longer line made an attack around the southern flank harder to supply. Behind the Gazala line were the Commonwealth Keep, Akroma, Knightsbridge and El Adem boxes, sited to block tracks and junctions. The box at Ritma was finished just before the Axis offensive, but work on the Point 171 and Bir El Gubi boxes did not begin until the 25th of May. By late May, the 1st South African Division was dug in nearest the coast, with the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division to the south and 1st Free French Brigade furthest left at Bir Hakeim. The British 1st and 7th Armoured Divisions waited behind the main line as a mobile counter-attack force. The 2nd South African Division garrisoning Tobruk and 5th Indian Infantry Division were in reserve. The British had 110,000 men, 843 tanks and 604 aircraft. Bir Hakeim. The fortress at Bir Hakeim, Old Man's Well, had been built by the Ottomans and later used as a station by the Italian Meharist, Camel Corps, to control movement at the crossroads of two Bedouin paths. The wells had long gone dry and it had been abandoned. Indian troops reoccupied the site to build a strong point and surround it with 50,000 mines. The fortification was a rough pentagon pointing north, about 4 times 5 kilometers. The troops were relieved by the 1st Free French Brigade, commanded by General Marie-Pierre Koenig, part of 30th Corps, Lieutenant General Willoughby Norrie. The French dug foxholes, entrenchments, gun emplacements and underground bunkers, then leveled and camouflaged the ground. The interior of the fort was divided into zones, each the responsibility of a unit, with Koenig's headquarters near the center, at the crossroads. The V-shaped anti-tank and anti-personnel minefields were patrolled by the 3rd Foreign Legion Battalion, Lamaze, in 63 times Bren gun carriers divided into 3 squadrons. The patrols moved along lanes in the minefields, paying particular attention to the area north to the 150th Brigade box at Gad el Ualeb. Battle of Gazala. At 2 p.m. on the 26th of May, the Italian 10th and 21st Corps began a frontal attack on the central Gazala line. A few elements of the Afrika Korps and 20th Mobile Corps participated, and during the day the bulk of the Afrika Korps moved north, to give the impression that it was the main attack. After dark, the armored formations turned south in a sweeping move around the southern end of the Gazala line. Early on the 27th of May, the main force of the Afrika Korps, Italian 20th Motorized Corps and the 90th Light Division went round the southern end of the Gazala line, using the British minefields to protect the Axis flank and rear. The Arit Division was held up for about an hour by the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade, 7th Armored Division, dug in some 6 kilometers southeast of Bir Hakeim. The 15th Panzer Division engaged the 4th Armored Brigade, which had come south to support the 3rd Indian and 7th Motorized Brigades, and the Germans were surprised by the range and power of the 75 mm guns on the new M3 Grants. The 4th Armored Brigade withdrew toward El Adem, and by late morning, the Axis armored units had advanced more than 25 miles north. The Axis advance was stopped around noon by the 1st Armored Division, in mutually costly fighting. On the right, the 90th Light Division forced the 7th Motorized Brigade out of Ritma eastwards on Bir El Gubi. Advancing toward El Adem at mid-morning, armored cars of the 90th Light Division came upon the advanced HQ of 7th Armored Division near Bir Beuid, dispersed it and took prisoner the commander, commander, Major General Frank Messervy, which left the division without effective command for 2 days. The 90th Light Division reached the El Adem area by mid-morning and captured a number of supply bases. Next day, the 4th Armored Brigade moved on El Adem and forced back the 90th Light Division to the southwest. Siege. The 27th of May, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, the rest of the 90th Light Division and the Arit Division, started the large encircling move south of Bir Hakeim as planned. The 3rd Indian Motor Brigade was surprised at 6:30 a.m. on the 27th of May and overrun at point 171, 4 southeast of Bir Hakeim, by the Arit Division and some German tanks, losing about 440 men and most of its equipment. The 7th Motor Brigade was then attacked at Ritma and forced back to Bir El Gubi. The 4th Armored Brigade advanced in support and collided with the 15th Panzer Division. The 8th Hussars were destroyed and the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, 3rd RTR, was severely damaged. The British inflicted considerable losses in return but then retired to El Adem. After overrunning the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade, 3 tank battalions of the Arit Division moved to the northeast of Bir Hakeim and the X Battalion, Colonel Presti Simone, with 60 tanks, changed direction towards the fort. The X Battalion arrived before the Bir Hakeim minefield and barbed wire at 8:15 a.m., charged and lost 31 tanks in a SEM-event. 10 tanks got through the minefield and were knocked out by 75 mm anti-tank fire and 124 Italian tank crew became casualties. The remnants of the X Battalion retired on the main body of the Arit Division, which moved north towards Bir El Harmad around noon, following Rommel's original plan. 28 to 30 May. On the 28th of May, the Desert Air Force, DAF, made a maximum effort to attack Axis columns around El Adem and Bir Hakeim but bombed Bir Hakeim and its surroundings in the poor visibility, misled by the Italian tank wrecks around the position. Koenig sent a detachment to destroy the wrecks to avoid any more mistakes. The group sent a column to make contact with the 150th Infantry Brigade, stationed further to the north. After a few hours, Italian artillery forced them to retire but the French column destroyed 7 enemy half-tracks. On the 29th of May, the detachment of Capitaine Gabriel de Sérigné destroyed 3 German tanks and British air attacks intercepted 2 Stuka raids and fighter bombers attacked supply lines south and east of Bir Hakeim. On the 30th of May, 620 soldiers from the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade, captured by the Axis and then released in the desert, reached the fort and added to the 243 prisoners already there, added to the water shortage. The detachment of Capitaine Lamaze, at the request of the 7th British Armoured Division, sealed off the breach opened the day before by the Axis tanks in the minefields. Led by Colonel Dimitri Amalakvari, the legionnaires were ambushed but managed to retreat with the help of the Bren carriers of the 9th Company Mesmer. The 31st of May, the 1st of June. On the 31st of May, the first day of a 2-day sandstorm, 50 supply trucks of the 101st Motorized Company of Captain Delau reached Bir Hakeim with water and took the Indians, prisoners and seriously wounded back to Allied lines. A raid by the detachments Mesmer, Daru and de Sérigné, led by Amalakvari, destroyed 5 tanks and an armored vehicle repair workshop. They had been forced to retreat westwards, to an area north of Bir Hakeim, which became known as the Cauldron, having attacked the 150th Infantry Brigade box since the 28th of May. The 150th Infantry Brigade was overrun late on the 1st of June, despite relief attempts, and the Axis gained a supply route through the 8th Army minefields north of Bir Hakeim. Next morning, the encirclement of the fort was resumed by the 90th Light Division, Trieste Division and 3 armored reconnaissance regiments from the Pavia Division. At 8 a.m., German troops approached from the south and Italian forces advanced from the north. 2 Italian officers presented themselves at 10:30 a.m. at the 2nd Foreign Legion Battalion lines, asking for the capitulation of the fort, which General Koenig rejected. 2 to 4 June. From 10 a.m. on the 2nd of June, both sides exchanged artillery fire but the French field guns were outranged by German medium artillery and the fort was bombed by German and Italian aircraft. Stukas raided Bir Hakeim more than 20 times but the French positions were so well built as to be almost invulnerable. The British were unable to reinforce the French, who repulsed the Arit Division attack, but on the 2nd of June the DAF had an easily observed bomb line around the fort and concentrated on the area with fighter patrols and fighter bomber attacks. The sight of scores of burning vehicles helped to maintain the morale of the defenders, who harassed Axis communications around the fort, as did the 7th Motor Brigade and the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade in the vicinity. On the 4th of June, the DAF fighters and fighter bombers disrupted Stuka attacks and bombed Axis vehicles, setting off an ammunition wagon in view of the French. Koenig signaled Air Vice Marshal Arthur Conyngham, "Bravo, merci pour la RAF," which brought the reply "Merci pour la sport." 5 to 7 June. From 5 to 6 June the DAF flew fewer sorties at Bir Hakeim, Concentrating on the Knightsbridge Box and around 11 a.m. on the 6th of June, the 90th Light Division attacked with the support of pioneers to try to clear a passage through the minefield. The pioneers got within 800 meters of the fort, having breached the outer minefield, and during the night managed to clear several passages into the inner perimeter. German infantry gained a foothold, but the French, in foxholes, dugouts and blockhouses, maintained a great volume of small arms fire, which forced the Germans under cover. After the disastrous failure of Operation Aberdeen, which had begun on the night of 4/5 June and was intended to destroy the Axis forces in the Cauldron, Ritchie considered withdrawing the French from the fort to release the 7th Motor Brigade, but decided to keep possession. On the 7th of June, 4 DOF raids were made against the Germans in the minefields. That night a last convoy approached the fort. An aspirant Belek got through the German lines and in thick fog, guided the convoy in. The Germans used the fog to prepare a final assault. Tanks, 88mm guns and Colonel Hacker's pioneers were formed up in front of the fort. 8 to 9 June. On the morning of the 8th of June, after the defeat of Operation Aberdeen released part of the 15th Panzer Division and grouped Hecker for the siege, Rommel commanded an attack from the north, approaching as close in a thick fog, with artillery firing directly against the fortifications. The Luftwaffe made constant attacks, including a raid by 45 Stukas, 3 Ju-88s and 10 Mi-110s, escorted by 54 fighters. Just before 10 a.m. the attack began, aiming at a low rise which would overlook the French defenses. The Chadian and Congolese defenders held on despite many casualties, and in the afternoon, another 60 Stukas bombed the perimeter and an attack was made all round the northern defenses. An ammunition dump was blown up and the perimeter forced back. Koenig reported that the garrison was exhausted, had suffered many casualties, was down to its reserve supplies, and asked for more air support in a relief operation. The DOF had made another maximum effort and flew a record 478 sorties. During the night, Hurricanes and Bostons dropped supplies to the garrison. On the morning of the 9th of June, 20 Ju-88s and 40 Ju-87s escorted by 50 Mi-110 and 109 fighters attacked Bir Hakeim. The Germans waited for the 15th Panzer Division, as the German artillery and aircraft bombarded the fort. A few skirmishes occurred between the 66th Infantry Regiment of the Trieste Division and the men of Lieutenant Burgoyne, whose unit was down only to hand grenades. At 1 p.m., 130 aircraft bombed the north face of the fort. The German infantry and the 15th Panzer Division attacked, supported by an artillery barrage. The attackers breached the 9th Company lines and the central position of aspirant Morvan, but the situation was restored with a Bren carrier counter-attack. Many DOF aircraft were unserviceable and the effort for the day was much reduced, but 2 Hurricanes dropped medical supplies. Diversions attempted by columns from the 7th Motor Brigade and the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade were too small to have much effect. In the afternoon, Messervy, the commander of the 7th Armored Division, signaled that a breakout might be necessary, and Koenig asked for DOF protection for an evacuation at 11 p.m. that night. This was too short notice and the garrison had to wait for another 24 hours until the night of the 10th of June, for a rendezvous to be arranged by the British to the south. Retreat, 10-11th June. During the 10th of June, the French hung on and suffered many casualties, with only 200 times 75mm rounds and 700 times mortar rounds left. Another attack on the northern sector against the Aubangui-Chari and 3rd Foreign Legion battalion lines was contained by a counter-attack by the Mesmer and Lamaze units, supported by Bren carriers and the last mortar rounds, and in the afternoon, the biggest air attack of the siege, a raid by 100 Stukas dropped 130 LT of bombs. The last rounds of ammunition were issued and bodies searched for spare bullets. Rommel predicted that Bir Hakeim would fall the next day but resisted pressure to attack with tanks, fearing that many would be lost in the minefields. As dark fell, sappers began to clear mines from the western face of the fortress. Heavy equipment was prepared for demolition and 2 companies were detailed to stay behind to disguise the retirement. A rendezvous was arranged with the 7th Motorized Brigade, which ran a convoy of lorries and ambulances to a point 7 kilometers south of the fort. Mine clearance by the sappers took longer than expected and they were only able to clear a narrow passage rather than a 200 meters corridor. Vehicles went astray and the ambulances and walking wounded left the perimeter 75 minutes late at 8:30 p.m. Koenig put the fort under the command of Amalakvari, the Foreign Legion commander, and left the fort with his female driver at the head of the column. A flare rose, the Axis troops nearby began to fire and the guide of the HQ column got lost and was blown up 3 times by mines. When Koenig caught up with the main column, it was blocked by troops of the 90th Light Division and he ordered a rush, regardless of the mines. Lamaze, Captain Bricagna and Lieutenant Dewey were killed in the melee. The reception was organized by 550 Company Royal Army Service Corps, RASC, which drove lorries and guided field ambulances with an experienced rear area Cruz, escorted by the 2nd King's Royal Rifle Corps, KRRC, and the 2nd Rifle Brigade on either side. The ambulances became separated in the dark but were recovered and guided to the rendezvous. The commander, the 3rd Battalion, was captured but most of the brigade managed to break out, reach Bir El Gubi, then withdraw to Gasr El Arid by 7 a.m. on the 11th of June. About 2,700 men, including 200 wounded of the original 3,600 men, escaped. During the day, British patrols picked up stragglers. Aftermath. Analysis. Possession of Bir Hakeim had made longer the Axis supply route, which caused many losses, and after the defeat at the Cauldron, the British got more time to recover. The French impressed the Axis forces facing them and raised morale among the Free French. From 2 to 10 June the DA flew about 1,500 sorties and lost 19 fighters over the fort, against about 1,400 Axis sorties in which 15 German and 5 Italian aircraft were shot down. The 7th Motor Brigade ran 4 supply convoys into Bir Hakeim from the 31st of May to the 7th of June. For the Free French, a victory was badly needed to show the Allies that the army of the French was a serious force that could contribute to the war against Germany. The term Free French was replaced by Fighting French, after the battle had shown the world that a revival after the catastrophic defeat in 1940 was underway. De Gaulle used it to undermine cooperation with the Vichy regime. In 1960, Playfair, the British official historian, wrote, "At the outset it had made longer and more difficult the enemy's temporary supply route, it had caused him many casualties, and it gave the British a chance to recover from their defeat in the Cauldron." General Koenig's brigade made a great impression upon the enemy by their courageous and enterprising resistance, and their success gave a well-won fillip to the pride of the Free French, who, for the first time in the Middle East, had fought the Germans and Italians in a complete formation on their own. ISO. Playfair and Auchinleck said on the 12th of June 1942, "The United Nations need to be filled with admiration and gratitude in respect of these French troops and their brave General Koenig." After the war, Generalmajor Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote, "In the whole course of the Desert War, we never encountered a more heroic and well-sustained defense." Casualties. Buell in 2002 and Ford in 2008 wrote of 141 French dead, 229 wounded and 814 men taken prisoner, with the loss of 53 guns and 50 vehicles. Axis losses of 3,300 dead or wounded, 227 captured, 164 vehicles destroyed and 49 aircraft shot down were recorded. In 2004, Porch recorded that the Axis took 845 prisoners at Bir Hakeim, only 10% of whom were French, and that Hitler ordered that German political refugees were to be killed, an order that Rommel ignored. Order of battle. Citations.